Okay, well, it's with great pleasure that I want to introduce Hilary Ibey to you, who's from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. And she's going to speak about the marine protection and climate change considerations in Canada.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? We did a little test earlier, but I want to make sure that you can still hear me.
Yes.
Super. Well, great. I'm so delighted to be here with you. I wish I could be with you in person. My goodness, it seems really very decadent that you can all be together in a room and having tea breaks together. So I'm here in my basement, as I've been for the past kind of year and a half. And in Canada, it is nighttime. So I'm going to just get my screen up and sharing, and maybe you can let me know once you can see it. And great. Okay. Give it a moment. Everything's a bit slow here. Okay, so really great pleasure to be here. Your workshop looks awfully interesting, and I'm sorry that I can't sit in on more of it. My name's Hilary Ibey. I'm here coming to you from Canada, from Ottawa, our nation's capital. I work for the federal government for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and I've been with the department for about 12 years, working on marine planning and conservation in a variety of forms, first on the west coast of Canada, and now here bordered by no oceans at all in the center of the country. Much of my work over the past 12 years has been really focused on co-management of these areas with Indigenous communities, of which we have many in Canada. And so I have a former boss really spoke a lot about how similar Canada and New Zealand were in the way that we use our exclusive economic zone in the types of fisheries that we do, and also in our relationships with Indigenous people. So really such a delight to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about marine protection and climate considerations in Canada. I'll go through some sort of high-level climate change impacts on Canada's oceans. We'll sort of referencing the IPCC report. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that over the past few hours already, and it's work that's familiar to you, so I'll try to breeze through that. I'll speak to some of the work that we've done to date, kind of more generally in marine conservation in Canada and some of our near-term plans. And then I'll turn to the meat of what I'm sure you're interested in hearing today, which is about the work we're doing on MPAs as nature-based climate solutions. So a couple of examples for you of things that we're doing in Canada. We don't have a sort of a strategy per se, but we certainly are starting to focus our energy a little bit more over the past couple of years on honing in on certain areas that are important to us. On how the work that we're doing in marine conservation really links in to mitigating the impacts of climate change. So as we know, climate change is causing impacts on the ocean, and we really see a lot of these impacts in Canada. Canada is bordered by 3 different oceans: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic Ocean, and these impacts are significant in all 3 of those oceans. Certainly on the warming front, we have my most significant example of that is I'm not sure if folks have heard about the blob, which is was a massive area off the Pacific coast, most significantly seen in the years sort of 2013 to 2015, but recurring since then as well. A massive area of warming waters, really nutrient poor. And we saw massive decreases in phytoplankton and really warm waters as a result of El Nino and other weather events. And we saw bird populations that we would measure in our protected areas off the west coast declining, really massive declines in bird populations. The common murre population declined by I don't have the statistic in front of me, but to a massive extent in subsequent years following these appearances of this blob. So you know, we see acidification effects. We have seen really substantially reduced Arctic sea ice cover in all months of the year, and that sort of amplifies the warming effects in the Arctic, and it's a sort of a cycle. We see sea level rise, and we see that happening. It transforms beaches on our east coast of Canada and off the coast of Nova Scotia. Beaches on the South Shore are really seeing massive erosion. And even in major cities that are close to the water, we're seeing major impacts of sea level rise, and then of course range shifts, marine species shifting their range and their seasonal activities in response to climate change. And of course, this all translates to substantial impacts on people, right? On humans, on our livelihoods, and certainly we see these impacts even more acutely in the Arctic, and of course in our coastal communities. But the Arctic seems to be even more vulnerable than other parts of the country to extreme weather events, climate-related hazards, sea ice loss, of course, and permafrost thaw. And this leads to a reduction in food and economic security. Food security is really critical in the Canadian Arctic. If you, when you go to a grocery store up there, a watermelon costs $25. You know, it's not a place where food is easily purchased, and so many of our Indigenous, our Inuit people tend to live off the land, and these are significant impacts for them. And then, of course, this loss of cultural identity associated with these major changes coming from climate impacts. The Haida people on the west coast of Canada have a saying that the world is as sharp as the edge of a knife, and you have to be careful or you'll fall off the other side. And translating to sort of this real need for balance in our interactions with the natural world, and needing to really take care to avoid reaching a point of no return. Right, and trying to restore balance where it's been lost. And so that kind of takes me to the work that Canada's been doing over the past few years in marine conservation in particular. In 2015, we had a new government come into power, and this new government took the unusual step of publishing ministers' mandate letters widely, making them publicly available for people to see, to sort of increase transparency, to increase accountability. And for us as lowly marine conservationists who had worked behind the scenes for many years, in 2016, we had conserved less than 1% of our ocean estate, which in Canada is significant. It's 5,750,000 kilometers squared. So it's a big area. And with less than 1% of our area conserved in 2015, 2016, suddenly having appearing in the minister's mandate letter and being a high priority on both the minister's and the prime minister's agenda was fairly significant for us. And so the mandate letter really recommitted the government to the Aichi Target 11, conserving 10% of our ocean by 2020. And it gave us an extra little push by giving us a 5% by 2017 kind of interim target to work towards first. And then in 2018, a new mandate letter came out, a revised mandate letter, which spoke to having met this 2017 target, continuing to encourage us in our efforts towards 10% by 2020, and also speaking to the effectiveness of protected areas. So adding in this commitment to develop new protection standards for both our marine protected areas and for our other effective area-based conservation measures. So in 2019, after a long piece of work by a national advisory panel, the government announced protection standards that prohibit oil and gas, mining, dumping, and bottom trawling in all of our new federal marine protected areas. And then a standard for other effective area-based conservation measures where the minister has to be satisfied that risks to the area have been effectively mitigated and addressed by any human activities that might be occurring. So this is substantially different from the way we have operated in the past, and added another layer of sort of, as I said before, effectiveness to our protections. And I think it's important for this group because you know, the sedimentation impacts, marine sediment is a real carbon sink, as we know, and I think you've probably heard that already today. And you've seen studies over the past couple of years that have indicated that trawling releases a massive amount of carbon into the atmosphere by stirring up those marine sediments. Likewise, oil and gas activities and other industrial activities that stir up that seabed. So again, I think just a few sort of key areas where we've been able to make some strides and really integrate the effectiveness of protection into the way that we're trying to offset some of the effects of climate change. So I spoke earlier to the fact that we had conserved less than 1% of our ocean in 2016. By 2019, we had hit 13.81%. And so this little rainbow map is one that we're particularly proud of in Canada. It shows all of our different federal protected areas surrounding us on the west coast of Canada, here up in the Arctic, and then down through the east coast, and then even into the estuary and Gulf of St. Lawrence. The area that really tipped us over the edge, I'll speak to at the end of the presentation, is this big red area at the top. This is the Tuvalu-Ituk Marine Protected Area, and I'll speak to that at the end of the presentation. Okay, and so no rest for the wicked. We managed to surpass our target, and then in 2019, with a new government, we had same government, new mandate. We were given a new mandate letter commitment to conserve 25% of our ocean by 2025, working towards 30% by 2030. With the idea, as with the last round, that the plan would be grounded in science and Indigenous knowledge and in local perspectives. The mandate commitment also added in this advocacy component, international advocacy, to set a goal of 30% by 2030 globally as well. And so Canada's been an active participant on the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, on the High Level Panel for Sustainable Ocean, and a number of other kind of international efforts to set these new targets. And then linked to that, over the past few months, actually, in April, we had our 2021 budget come out, and budget 2021 for us earmarked an unheard of number for marine conservation, almost $1 billion over 5 years, to help Canada reach its 25 by 25 target. So, I mean, this coming to a program that has sort of had $1 million here and there, maybe 8 million one year, which felt really big to us. So this was a huge investment in increasing our protections, but also in looking at this massive increase in area conserved already and trying to make sure that we're managing it effectively and monitoring it effectively. And so one of the things that you see a lot in the literature is, in terms of climate change, is MPAs as sentinel sites, right? As sites that you'd be able to see a change coming quickly because of climate change. But we've monitored our sites over time, but we haven't really had many sites to monitor, first of all, and we haven't really had enough money to do a substantial monitoring program. So this really changes that for us, and I think gives us great hope for a sort of time series of monitoring data that will allow us to identify areas that are maybe at early warning signs of impacts of climate change coming to us. So just a really brief slide, because I know time is ticking away, but we do have some sites already announced as areas of interest that will be advancing over the coming years. again, these are all federal, different colors for different federal sites. And when you look at this, you realize that that won't be nearly enough, and we're going to need to identify new and more areas to protect in order to meet these really highly ambitious new commitments that the government's made. So, you know, to our challenge today, nothing that keeps me awake at night, one of the things that keeps me awake at night, other than my small children and all the other things that one worries about in the world, is to the extent that there was any low-hanging fruit, that low-hanging fruit has now been harvested. And so we have our work cut out for us over the next couple of years. So turning to kind of the meat of the presentation, in Canada, we really feel strongly that MPAs are sort of nature-based climate solutions. So well-designed and well-managed MPAs, we really do believe are going to be effective for conserving nature, conserving biodiversity, and for mitigating the impacts of climate change. And we see this playing out under our new mandate in a couple of areas. Certainly thinking quite a lot about the Arctic for all of the reasons that I've kind of lined up for you up until now, and focusing on large areas as well. So areas that can conserve kind of bigger swaths of the sea. We also, and we have some examples of this to date, have focused on carbon sinks, so things like corals and sponges, particularly sponge reefs in Canada, and then continuing to work on conservation network planning, which has been an effort that has been underway for a long time in my world, to support this work and to really think carefully about placement of these areas and making sure that we're working with our partners, our provincial, our territorial, our Indigenous partners, as well as really closely with stakeholders, with the fishing industry, with our environmental and geo partners and others, to plan out areas that are logical and make sense for the long term. And so conservation network planning, as I say, has been a key piece of work in Canada over the past 10 years or more. And it's really important work, and it moves quite slowly. So you need a lot of science to underpin conservation networks, and that science takes time to develop. And then in many cases, collaboration with our government partners, with Indigenous governments, is really important work in it, but it certainly means that we're at the mercy of election cycles in all levels of government, and you know, different priorities sometimes from a province to a federal government, and then of course making sure that we are involving stakeholders to the extent that that we can, to make sure that their interests and their expertise is really well integrated into the planning work that we're doing. All that to say that we're implementing conservation network planning in priority bioregions in Canadian waters. We identified 12 bioregions, and I would say probably there are sort of 4 active conservation network planning efforts happening in these bioregions, and in other regions we're doing sort of more broad-based marine spatial planning to support that conservation network planning, or sorry, I should say conservation network planning that supports that broader-based marine spatial planning as well. And really, when you think about climate change and you think about designing these networks, you think about these underpinning design principles that support planning for climate change. So to me, the 2 key design principles for network planning that are critical for climate change, mitigating climate change impacts in the future, are connectivity and representation. Really thinking about maintaining ecological linkages across broad areas and diminishing the expected disruptions to those critical linkages and pathways where we know they're occurring already. So that goes back to needing the science to support this work. And some of that science it's going to have to be climate change modeling, and we're sort of starting to do that work in Canada, and then of course over time being able to adaptively manage the network and deal with whatever the results of monitoring are telling us we need to do. So for us, network planning is a great tool for thinking about how you mitigate the impacts of climate change over a longer period of time and over a larger area while still allowing for other activities to occur in between. Carbon sinks. We know that ocean warming and acidification have significant impacts on the health of our corals and sponges. We're also learning that they can serve as carbon sinks and as really important carbon sequestration areas. So in Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans really has had a really long-term focus on protecting cold water corals and globally unique glass sponge reefs in Canadian waters. We have been actively involved in work on vulnerable marine ecosystems in the NAFO areas, certainly identifying ecologically and biologically significant areas for many years, focusing in on corals and sponges. The department, under our sustainable fisheries framework, has a sensitive benthic areas policy that really supports the conservation of corals and sponges. And for a number of years, there were centers of expertise, across Canada that focused on corals and sponges. And many regions of Canada developed coral and sponge conservation strategies. Close to my heart, because I worked on a number of these areas on the Pacific coast of Canada, we have now an Oceans Act marine protected area. So these yellow blobs, these are the Hecate Strait and Queen's Charlotte Sound glass sponge reefs marine protected area, as well as a series of, I think we now have 17 marine refuges in place in the Strait of Georgia and Howe Sound, which is in the southern portion of off the coast of BC, really quite an urban area and a really well-traveled area. So the glass sponge reefs in Hecate Strait are amazing. These are 9,000-year-old sponge reefs, glass sponge reefs made of silica, 4 different species of sponges that are unusually reef forming. And so they're ancient. They're kind of 25 at their tallest point. They're 25 meters tall, 15 kilometers wide, 35 kilometers long. These ancient and still living sponge reefs. So one of the scientists who studied these reefs in Germany in fossilized form on land for many years likened the discovery of these sponge reefs to discovering a herd of dinosaurs roaming the earth. And so over the course of a number of years, we were able to put a marine protected area in place to protect these important and really quite beautiful creatures. And then we started to discover smaller reefs in the Strait of Georgia and in Howe Sound, and divers had been telling us about these areas, and fishermen as well for many years. And so we began to put marine refuges in place over these areas, fisheries closures that meet our definition of other effective area-based conservation measures. And the nice thing about having recognition for these areas and protection for these areas is that we now are beginning to monitor these areas, and that's allowing us to estimate the carbon storage capacity of glass sponge reefs. And this longer term, early days of kind of longer term monitoring is showing us how amazing they are. They're filter feeders, and it turns out that they filter up to 1 gram of carbon per meter squared per day, which is comparable filtration rate to old growth forests, to the marine vegetation blue carbon sequestration rates. So that really, they're protecting these areas has become even more acutely important with these discoveries. Sponge reefs, so neat. Sorry to wax poetic about them. Finally, again, we've talked quite a lot about the Arctic over the course of the presentation, and you know, impacts of climate change have been noted throughout the Arctic, including in the high Arctic. And there's been a really rapid decline in sea ice cover over the past 30 years. My comparison isn't great for folks across on the other side of the world, but over the past 3 decades, the Arctic Ocean has lost an area of sea ice equivalent to 2 of our 10 provinces. So that, of course, makes the Arctic more accessible to commercial activities like shipping and fisheries, tourism, mining. And WWF, in fact, identified an area of the high Arctic in Canada, and it's actually sort of, I'm outlining it with my cursor here. I don't know if you can see, but really the sort of full extent of this map almost was identified by WWF and scientists, of course, as the last ice area. So the area where it's expected that year-round sea ice is expected to last the longest in Canadian waters, and I think internationally as well. And so between 2017 and 2019, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Parks Canada Agency, another federal department, engaged with our key Inuit partners and territorial governments, as well as other federal departments and agencies and NGOs and industry, towards establishing a marine protected area in this really important part of the world. And in August 20, oops, sorry, here we go. And in August 2019, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Government of Canada, with the Government of Nunavut, which is one of our territories, and the Kikitani Inuit Association to establish a formal working relationship to protect this blue area here, Tuvalu-Ituk, which is Inuit, an Inuit word that means where the ice never melts. This is an area that has really significant food security impacts for Inuit people. These communities, Grise Fjord, Resolute, Arctic Bay, Pond Inlet, and Clyde River, are all really reliant on sea ice for food security. It's also a refuge for ice-dependent species, of course, and for under ice communities, which is a bit different from some of these other areas. These under ice communities are quite unique. And so one of the things that we were able to do in this area as a result of some of the massive changes under the 2016 mandate was we had amended our Oceans Act to add in an ability to put an MPA by ministerial order in place. And so this freezes the footprint of an area for up to 5 years while we do additional science and consultation that's necessary to really solidify a long-term governor and council marine protected area for long-term protection. Tuvalu-Ituk in August 2019 became the first MPA to be designated by ministerial order under the Oceans Act. And we continue to work with the Kikitani Inuit Association, the Government of Nunavut, and our federal partners to explore what we're going to do to make sure that this area is protected in the longer term. And that is it. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I think I'm doing okay. Maybe I've gone over a little bit. I did hope to have a little bit of time to respond to any questions that folks might have.
Any questions?
Hi there, Hilary. Hi from New Zealand. Through the internet to you in Canada. A couple of questions quickly. New Zealand has yet to commit to 30 by 30. Any thoughts on that and the international process more broadly? And then the second one, it's really interested in that great new MPA up the top. Has there been discussions with the governments of, well, Greenland and Denmark, I guess, about extending it into their territory as well?
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first, because that's an easier one. There's been quite a lot of work through the Inuit Circumpolar Council, so with both the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland through the Kingdom of Denmark, and Inuit communities in Greenland and in Canada as well, to look at an area called the Pikila-Sorsuaq, which is the area, sort of North Water Polinia area, right down in between. I'm pointing to something in the air that's in my mind. Just a moment, we'll go back to an earlier map. This area here, and certainly the Pikila-Sorsuaq Commission released a report, and there's been work in Canada with Inuit communities as well as internationally to look at what exactly we might do in that area, whether it is some sort of form of marine spatial planning, whether there'll be some marine protected area work happening, but it'll all happen really in lockstep with Inuit communities. In response to your question about 30% by 2030, I have certainly we have a mandate to advocate for this level of protection. I think anything that we do in terms of increasing our numbers needs to be effective protection, right? So for me, one of my great frustrations has been pursuing numbers without thinking about what we're going to do about managing those areas and monitoring those areas in the long term. And I know that that's a frustration that's shared amongst stakeholders and Indigenous communities across Canada and provinces and territories as well. So we certainly, I certainly believe that any type of protection you're putting in place needs to be effective protection. So you're not just putting numbers in place for numbers' sake. That said, a percent target is certainly a really effective driver for governments, and it has really borne fruit for us, I would say.
Hi, Kira, bonjour, from New Zealand. Look, you talk about conservation, you talk about to conserve, you talk about MPAs. I was wondering whether you had to go through a definition of an MPA or what you call conservation that would suit the Western view of the world and the Indigenous view of your world, which sometimes overlap but may extend into different directions. And so the definition itself of what conserving means may not mean the same thing for two different peoples. Have you had these discussions, and what were your conclusions?
It's a very good question. Certainly, I work for the federal government, and we subscribe to the IUCN definition of a marine protected area. Conservation is a broader term and gives us a little bit more breadth of the type of tools that we can use. But in Canada, we have so many different Indigenous communities, all of which have really strong ideas about conservation. And the Indigenous communities in Canada also do really incredible stewardship work and have really this really important worldview that has sort of stewardship at its base. And I certainly over many years have learned a lot from Indigenous partners that I've worked with about how these areas need to be treated. And also that in many cases, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier about food security, right? So in Canada, food, social, and ceremonial fisheries are protected under law and for Indigenous people, and the only and on a case-by-case basis, if there's a true conservation need and you can prove that there's a true conservation need, that's the only reason that you could use to close those food, social, ceremonial fisheries. And I guess to be even more specific, in the Arctic, because food fishing is really Inuit people there are so few of them in the Arctic, and food fishing is so critical to their way of life. We really see a need to allow that to continue in most of our areas, unless we can really identify some kind of really critical conservation need that can't be met in another way.
Catherine.
Hi, Hilary. Catherine Short, thanks very much for your presentation. It's so heartwarming to see the last ice area finally protected. I was at WWF International when I remember the Arctic program beginning the advocacy on it, and you didn't explicitly mention, but as I understand it, it's the last place where polar bears will be okay globally because the ice will stay there. I hope that's correct. And my question builds on Geoffroy's question. Did Canada explore the use of the Indigenous protected area caveat as section in the IUCN framework for your protected areas? And if you did, what did you learn, etc.? Thanks.
Yeah, Indigenous protected and conserved areas are such an interesting concept, and I feel in some ways Canada's a little bit behind the times, or maybe just a little bit of it's taking the federal government a little while to catch up to how far advanced Indigenous groups are. Terrestrially, there was a really big effort over the past kind of the 2017 to 2019 to develop this report, the ICE report, Indigenous ICE report. I can't remember what it stands for now, but this was a terrestrial report that really spoke to what Indigenous protected and conserved areas were to Indigenous people in Canada, and how they should be developed. And we don't have a marine equivalent just yet, and we do see a lot of, we know Indigenous people believe that there are real connections that the terrestrial and the marine can't be unpicked from one another. And we struggle to develop a policy that would cover that well federally, while still really allowing these areas to be Indigenous led and Indigenous driven. So certainly a lot of our marine protected areas are jointly designated. And so for example, the Skunk-Inglis-Bowie Seamount Marine Protected Area on the west coast of Canada was first designated by the Haida people as a protected area, and then subsequently designated as an Oceans Act Marine Protected Area by the federal government. And we co-manage that area, cooperatively manage that area. And I think, you know, that type of work has its challenges. The Indigenous groups and the federal government don't always work super well together, although we certainly do try our best. And but I'm quite interested in the concept of IPCAs, because I think there's so much potential there for a sort of a different type of conservation and a different type of a different way of operating. And so we are really working on how we would recognize those areas federally and what that would look like, but we're not really quite there yet.
Okay, if we could all thank Hilary very much for staying up late